Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 24 and complete the passage, complete the chapter, complete the unit, and complete the books of Samuel in this video. And if you haven't been watching all the way through, or if you have, either way, I want to thank you for choosing to watch this one and to continue throughout the entire books of Samuel, which I think are among the most underappreciated books in the entire Bible and have so much to say about the issues we face today of power and religion and politics and things. So if you've enjoyed these videos, I really encourage you to tell other people about them and encourage them to subscribe and continue to watch these. So as we enter into this, we're at the very end here. And as we do, I've been noting throughout the first two videos on this chapter a number of curious things about it. And I want to focus on that now as I prepare to explain a whole different interpretation of this chapter. So what we've been looking at is to see a whole series of issues. And I'm just going to go through these. And if you haven't been following, just stay with me if you can, so we can see how all these different pieces don't seem to fit together unless we do something else with the story. So, why is Yahweh angry at Israel in the first place? No reason is given. Then, having said that, the narrator saying that to us, why would Yahweh, quote unquote, incite David to call for a census? Especially if we think that the census is a bad thing, which, as we saw, it isn't necessarily. Why does Joab object to the census? No reason is given, but plainly he finds a reason to object. And then what argument does David make for why he will call the census? And again, we don't hear it. We're just told that his argument is stronger, his views are stronger than Joab's, so we don't hear what they are. Why did the census path focus on cities beyond the tribal regions? And I noted here that they started all the way over here in the city of Or, and then all the way up and across and through Hivite and Canaanite cities, and then down to the Negev of Judah down there. But why all the cities and why all the foreign places to be looking for Israelites and Judahites? Why in verse 10 is David suddenly, quote, hit in the heart about numbering the people, given that nothing stimulates that? Neither Yahweh nor Joab or the people or anything else happens to cause him to suddenly have regrets for doing something that Yahweh told him to do. Then why does Yahweh respond to David indirectly through the prophet Gad? David telling Yahweh that I've sinned, and yet Yahweh goes indirectly through the prophet Gad, who we don't otherwise know about except for one example, rather than talking to David directly. Why does Gad's offer of three choices, if we recall that, if we haven't watched it, the famine, the pursuit by enemies, or the pestilence, not mention anything about Yahweh's anger or the census as the reason for the offer? As I was noting in the last video, they seem to come across as if they're three wishes, as if there might be something good that's being offered, and there's no sense of any relationship. Why these three choices? Famine, pursuit by foes, or pestilence in verse 13? Why in verse 16, as I noted last time, the sudden appearance of the destroying angel, clearly echoing what happened in the Exodus story? Why would the angel be prepared to destroy Jerusalem if the punishment was 3 days of pestilence, which seemed to be almost already done? And then continuing in verse 16, why does the angel seem to stop or hover over the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite? Why right there in particular? Why in that same verse 16 does Yahweh regret the evil of the impending destruction? Since it was Yahweh who incited David to do it in the first place, now why does Yahweh regret that? When David continues to say that the sin is on him and that the sheep, the ordinary people, shouldn't have consequences for this, although 70,000 of them are already dead, why does David call for the consequences to call, unquote, my father's house? Why does Gad, or Yahweh, order David to erect an altar on the threshing floor? What does that have to do with what we've seen so far? Then why the shift in language from pestilence, dever, which we noted was a wordplay with devar, word, in verses 13 to 15, to plague, magaphe, in verses 21 to 25, as if they were the same thing, but plainly they're not the same thing? Why does David explain to Araunah the reason for wanting to buy the threshing floor is to avert the plague, which has already taken place, if we equate the pestilence with the plague? And if not, then what is this plague in addition to the pestilence, in which Yahweh seemingly had already stopped? Why the threshing floor of a Jebusite in particular, the previous residents of Jerusalem, whom we saw at 2 Samuel 5, 6-7, that David attacked in order to take possession of the city? Why the purchase controversy, the seemingly giving it away and then insisting on price, just like Abraham negotiating with the Hittites in Genesis 23, and the seemingly incredibly small price of 50 shekels, given the 400 shekels that Abraham paid for the cave and the plot of land there? And why does the scene end by saying that David's altar and offerings caused Yahweh to be supplicated, using the exact same language as at 21:14 and framing the chiasm perfectly there? That's a lot of questions, and I'm not going to go over them all, but many of them have no apparent answer if we take the story, as scholars have tended to take it, as about one of two things. Either about the evil of the census, or adjacent to that, some evil of counting, having to do with usurping divine authority, that David shouldn't be doing that. But as I was noting in the previous video, that makes no sense because we've seen other censuses, and we see the one that happens after this, in the sense of the narrative after David is Solomon, and certainly in a text that's very late in 2 Chronicles, a post-exilic text for sure, where Solomon takes a census, and there's no problem with that at all, even though they're not the Israelites, and that could arguably make the point. But in the end of our story, it's not really about the census at all. What is it really about? And I'd like to suggest that's parallel to what we saw in chapter 21, back up here, where the blood guilt on Saul was not assuaged by the Gibeonites' demand for the death of 7 of Saul's grandsons, but by the nonviolent witness of Rizpah that led David to the peaceful thing of gathering the bones of Jonathan and Saul and all of the descendants and give them proper burial in one place. I'd like to suggest that's the key, because in our immediate situation, similarly, whether it's the census or something else that Yahweh is angry about, and I'll mention that in a minute, the death of 70,000 does not assuage Yahweh's anger. What assuages the anger is the offering of sacrifices on the threshing floor. So there's something plainly parallel there. And note, the not assuaged by the death of 7 grandchildren, not assuaged by the death of 70,000 Israelites and Judahites. Hardly can that be a coincidence. So I'd like to suggest, as we enter into our passage, beginning with verse 18, and you can see on the left side, and finish the scene, the chapter, the book, and the books, this is a much later reflection, as I've been noting throughout. And if you haven't watched the introductory video to chapters 21 to 24, I encourage you to do that, where I share some of the evidence for why these chapters are late. But I'd like to suggest this in particular, and certainly the compilation of them all together in this unit and the insertion of them in this place, after David has regained the throne after the Absalom and Sheba rebellions, and before the succession that takes place in 1 Kings, the authors are offering what I'd suggest is an exilic or post-exilic reflection on the failure of monarchy. And that what Yahweh's angry about is Israel asking for a king and rejecting Yahweh as king all the way back in 1 Samuel 8. And what David sees himself as sinning here is representing taking up the monarchy and presuming to rule in Yahweh's place. And in place of that, as my note has here in the green here, it moves into a new direction, that assuaging God not with war and violence, but with sacrifice and the temple. And this would be written at a time when the temple was already destroyed by the Babylonians, but there's a hope for rebuilding it. And we see that hope for rebuilding it in many texts, in Leviticus, and especially exilic texts like Leviticus, Ezekiel, and especially in Ezra and Nehemiah, where it's claimed to be financed by the Persians for their own benefit and conditioned by the refusal to allow foreigners to be there, and especially foreign wives and children. And then we compare this throughout. We see the list of David's warriors, and as we see there on the screen with Uriah the Hittite, were all foreigners. And then we see here Araunah the Jebusite is precisely one of those people that in the Deuteronomistic theology were supposed to be destroyed to make the land pure. So rejecting the Deuteronomic view that people as a whole, or Yahweh directly, or Yahweh working through the divinely authorized king, can protect the Israelites and Judahites from sin by destroying foreigners through war or other means is wrong. And that a right relationship with Yahweh comes, as Rizpah illustrates, and as David's final response illustrates, with nonviolent relationship with Yahweh that honors Yahweh as the only real source of judgment, vengeance, or of life and death. And that's what I'd suggest is put in here, especially so that we will hear the succession story in 1 Kings in light of that. So let's begin to enter into the immediate story here with all that long introduction and see if that makes sense out of our immediate scene. So we're on this chiastic shape right here, right at the bottom. And that's what we need to be looking at now, and so that's where we are. So that day, highlighting the simultaneity of events. So in that sense, it's still the one day in which 70,000 died. The angel came to Jerusalem and was stopped, that you can see right here on the right side of the screen, and said, "Go and erect an altar to Yahweh on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." Now, we'd only seen that the angel was by the threshing floor. That's only to us as readers. David doesn't know about that, or at least hasn't heard it. So this is the first thing he's hearing about the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And the first thing we need to look at is threshing floors. Threshing floors are places obviously of fertility, because it's where the wheat is separated from the chaff and food for people is provided. It's also, because of that, a place for sexuality. As you can see famously in the passage of Ruth down here, where we see this scene. Now here's our kinsman Boaz with these young women who have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, where they will meet and have secret sex. Let's go over the other threshing floor things so we can see what the context is as we get into our passage. So we saw a couple times in Numbers, and it shouldn't surprise us, we've seen many echoes of our scene in the book of Numbers, including the census, and as we'll see, including a plague that's averted by sacrifice. So see, here, it's a donation from the threshing floor as the first batch of dough to suggest that before they take it for themselves, they offer some to Yahweh. And similarly here, that it's taken from the fullness of the threshing floor and often associated with the winepress. And as you see that again in Deuteronomy, the wheat and the wine together, and sometimes associated with oil as the holy trinity of foods for the Middle Eastern people here. Then you can see that in the chapter 16, which is about keeping all the feasts in Jerusalem, the festival of Booths or Sukkoth, you gather in the produce from the threshing floor and from your winepress. So they're expressing the fertility that God has provided. Here in the Judges passage, Gideon, around the question of whether Gideon would be the vehicle for God's liberation, engages in this little act of laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor, and we won't get into that whole little scene. We saw in the beginning of 1 Samuel, the only other reference to threshing floors here, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floor. So we saw that there. Then we see this scene in 1 Kings, which is paralleled in 2 Chronicles. The king of Israel and King Jehoshaphat of Judah were sitting on their thrones, arrayed in their robes, at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and the prophets were prophesying before them. So there, for a place of fertility at the entrance of the gate of the capital city. And then we see down here, and we won't get in the context of the scene in 2 Kings, but again, the threshing floor and the winepress associated there. Jeremiah, prophesying from exile, talks about daughter Babylon like a threshing floor at the time it is trodden, and that the sense of the image of the threshing floor as being stamped upon, similar to pressing on the wine grapes that we see in apocalyptic texts like the book of Revelation. In Hosea, we see it, the prostitutes pay on the threshing floor in that sense. So an illicit sexual liaison at the threshing floor, and the chaff that swirls, which echo, as we know, if New Testament readers, into John the Baptist talking about Matthew and Luke in the sense of the separating the wheat and the chaff on the threshing floor. Then in Joel, the promise of abundance, and the threshing floor is filled with grain and the vats filled with wine and oil. There you see all three of them together. In Micah, we see the hidden element, that they don't know the thoughts of Yahweh or God's plan, in that he has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor. So they're as ignorant as the grain there. And Job has one more reference simply to grain on the threshing floor. We notice the one on Ruth. And then we get to the key one here in 2 Chronicles. Solomon began to build the house of Yahweh in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, the only place in the Bible that's mentioned, where Yahweh had appeared to his father David at the place that David had designated on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Boy, there's a lot going on there. The only other reference to Moriah is in Genesis 22, not as Mount Moriah, but simply as Moriah, the place that Yahweh will send Abraham at that point to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. We knew nothing about what that place was there. It's simply called Moriah. It was a 3-day journey from where he was, but that's all we know about it. It's not associated with the mountain. So the authors of 2 Chronicle are making quite the leap from taking the place that Abraham was rescued from offering Isaac in sacrifice, and then offers the ram in sacrifice instead, equates that with the threshing floor of a slightly different named Araunah the Jebusite, and equates that with the place where the foundation of the house of Yahweh, the Jerusalem temple, is built, pulling together Genesis and the books of Samuel and the books of Chronicles, all into a consistent story that everything was pointing toward building the Jerusalem temple, even though the authors of Chronicles know that the temple built by Solomon was long ago destroyed, and that the one that they're raising up is a substitute, is the second one. So that's all the context there for build the altar to Yahweh at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. But we need to continue in the story to make sense of the whole thing. So Gad came to David and told him that. David doesn't ask any questions. It seems to make sense to him. Why does it? Who knows? And we see Falkman below saying David's still ignorant, assumes that Gad is calling for an expiatory offering. Maybe, but since he's silent, we can't really know what David's assuming. So following Gad's instructions are literally his words. David went up as Yahweh had commanded. Had Yahweh commanded? Gad didn't say Yahweh had commanded it. So that's David's interpretation, that Gad's word is Yahweh's word. And we hadn't heard it, but it's certainly a reasonable interpretation, but we don't know that. When Araunah looked down, and we noted last time that Baden had suggested in my note on verse 16 that Araunah is actually a Jebusite word for Lord, and that this is not actually the person's name. But Baden's view is assuming that this story is actually trying to convey something historical from the time of David, and he's trying to look behind the supposed propaganda to what really happened. I'm suggesting this story is part of this collection from chapter 21 to 24, written hundreds of years later, and has nothing to do with specific history, but everything to do with the bigger picture of the monarchy from the time of exile. So when Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming toward him, or literally passing through. It's the Hebrew word again, and that highlights the whole sense of the Israelites of having passed through to get in this land that wasn't theirs in the first place, and the Deuteronomic order that the only way there'll be peace in the land amongst themselves and with the neighbors and with Yahweh is to destroy them all and stay away from them and not intermarry them. And yet we've seen that this Jerusalem environment of David is filled with foreigners. They've not passed over, in other words, separating from a foreign land to their own land. But here, the passing over is simply in this space toward Araunah's land. And Araunah went out and prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground, or literally his nose to the ground, as we saw in the beginning in verse 1 there. And then he says, why is my lord the king, acknowledging what to him is a foreigner, but what's he going to do in this case, since we don't know of any other Jebusites in the story world that are still there? Could he be the only one? He's the only one mentioned. And David said, to buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to Yahweh, so the plague may be averted from the people. And then we want to go, wait, what is going on there? We saw that it had already been stopped, that Yahweh already said to the angel, stop, and that 70,000 had already died. And as I was noting, this is a different word, magaphe, not dever. And it's a different word again in verse 25, as we can see, matching chiastically there. So if we note some other places where this word magaphe is used, we can see it's in Exodus 9:14. I will send my plagues upon you, so you may know there is no one like me in all the earth, to highlight the sovereignty of Yahweh. We see it twice in Numbers, and I won't bring those up, which are connected not too distantly to a census, but not caused by a census, but they're supplicated with offerings. And then we see these a couple of plague situations earlier. But the term magapha is often used to not describe what pestilence is, some kind of infection, but it can also mean mass slaughter, as we see in a number of cases. And you can see one here where that same word is used for a massive slaughter. So maybe what's being averted here is not the pestilence, but the ongoing slaughter that 70,000 dead represent, but not just caused directly by Yahweh, but by war, by the very violence that we see chiastically just before our scene with a list of warriors and the constant description of them striking down and killing people. So perhaps the plague here is precisely the plague of violence that monarchy reinforces as if it was Yahweh's will. But Yahweh, as we've seen, has already expressed his own regret for allowing that to happen. And so now the question is, will monarchy stop killing people, both their own and others? And I'd suggest that's what's going on here. The word for averted here, tzer, is 46 times in the Masoretic text, but it chiastically is matching in chapter 21 and connecting here 21 and 25, as I was just showing you. So then Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering and the threshing that's hard to say, isn't it? Threshing sledges, try to say that one a few times, and the yoke of the oxen for the wood. All this, O king, Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God respond favorably. But the king said, no, I will buy them. And I've gone quickly over that, but that certainly echoes what we'd see from Genesis 23, where Abraham seemingly was arguing uselessly with Hittites who were trying to give him the land to bury Sarah, but he kept arguing. And as I was noting there, the seeming giving was hiding the fact that they had the power and that they eventually extracted 400 shekels from David for that piece of land and made him buy the whole piece of land when he only wanted the cave. Here the power dynamics are the opposite, where the king obviously has all the power and Araunah has virtually no power at all. But to make it look legitimate, it's bought. And David says that, so it won't look like it cost me nothing. Why is it important to the authors that the foundation of the temple is purchased? Well, why was it important in Genesis 23 to show that the entry into the land, not the entry into the land, but the acquisition of the land came not by violence, by purchase? And that suggests a similar thing here, that the purchasing of the threshing floor is an alternative to what we saw in the only other Jebusites in the book, which was attacking them and killing them. So just as Abraham had originally rescued Lot by getting in a war that we saw back in Genesis 14, eventually his relationship with the natives and the indigenous people is by purchase and by peace. I'd like to suggest that's what the authors of this chapter are saying for the post-exilic situation, that we can negotiate financially with the neighbors and we can live peacefully with them, but we will not go to war with them. So going back here a little bit, what seems good is, as always, is what's good in your own eyes. The threshing, I won't say it again, the sledges and the yokes is typical, and that's the same story, but with Araunah as we see in 1 Chronicles 23. And then we saw your God. So Araunah's not saying it's his God, and that highlights that they move on peacefully together, worshiping different gods in the same place. So adjacent to this temple that's going to be built, Araunah is saying you can build something, or you can you can make an altar and offer sacrifice to your God. It doesn't have to be my God, and we can live peacefully in that way. The responding favorably is only one other time in the whole Deuteronomistic history, but we saw it in Genesis 33, and with Genesis in the air, it shouldn't surprise us, Jacob to Esau responding favorably. And so we come to the last verses here. As I noted, King said, I will buy it from you for a price. It's doubled here. We see it in 1 Kings 10:28 and 21:2, both with negative overtones. And we already looked at that cost me nothing. The word for cost is hinam, and we only see that one other time. It's not inherently about money, but about value in general. And what it's really costing David is the end of monarchy. And at exile, we know that means that there will no longer be, after that point, someone from the family of David on the throne. In other words, the 50 shekels are just a symbol that will cost David everything. There will no longer be a Davidic monarch until the New Testament authors decide that a guy named Yeshua is in the line of David. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for a mere 50 shekels, no apparent negotiation on price. The shekels we've seen a couple other times in the books of Samuel, but certainly echoing what we see in Genesis 23 of silver. And that and David built an altar, almost stopped right there, but not quite, and offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being. And so now Yahweh was supplicated. It's exactly the same language. Why the NORSV renders it differently in 21:14 as now, but it's exactly the same language. And now we see the plague was averted. And so that's what I'd suggest the whole thing is about, that it's not about the census as such. The census is a distraction, much like the killing of the sons of Saul in chapter 21 is a distraction. Yes, that wasn't a good thing. Yes, killing the sons wasn't a good thing, but Yahweh didn't want that. Yahweh called for the census, but then repents. Yahweh regrets and repents and decides instead that the future of the relationship of Israel and Judah with Yahweh is going to be offering nonviolent sacrifices rather than the bodies of themselves and their enemies. And with that, the books of Samuel end, but not the David story in the succession, which continue in the books of Kings. See you then for that.